Yeah. Okay. Hello, everyone. Hello, Father Matthew.
Hello, Deacon Adam. Good to see you.
Good to see you. I'm your co-host of Stories That Work, and I'm enjoying that every time, that intro.
Oh yeah, I like that intro. It's good. It's
I
good.
I could listen to it a little bit longer. I think it's
we, we can work on that. Maybe we'll work on a closing too.
yeah. And I need to make some updates. So I've got
Hey, Deacon Adam, let's begin with a prayer.
oh yeah, yeah.
Okay. In the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, amen. O Christ our God, you came among your disciples and gave them peace. So also come among us and give us peace. And open our hearts that we may do your will in all things. For you are holy always, now and ever, and unto ages of ages. Amen.
Amen. Thank you for helping me stay grounded.
That's why I'm here. That's why
Yeah.
I'm here.
Yes.
All right, updates.
Okay, update. So, yeah, I have two things to share, and then you and I will share the third thing together.
Okay.
First one is we have transformed the evangelism conference in May. America's mostly shut down. Things might be back to normal by then, but we don't know. And so we just went ahead and decided to change things over. And so we're going to be doing a virtual conference instead of the conference in Chicago. It will be on May 9th. Details are slowly developing, and what we have available now is you can go see it at missionsnevangelism.com. And instead of doing evangelism, because we don't know how long we're going to be tracked in our homes, and it's kind of hard to do person-to-person evangelism, when you're the only people you're seeing are people that probably don't want you to evangelize them, like your wife and your kids, right? And so so we're going to change the theme a little bit, and the theme is going to be on personhood, which is an important topic within the Orthodox faith. We have confirmed that His Grace Bishop Anthony will still give the keynote address, so we're excited about that. We've tweaked some of our talks to address personhood specifically. So we're postponing the evangelism conference. I don't know if we're going to do it in the fall or if we're going to do it next year. We're kind of just waiting to see how everything's going to unfold before we can schedule that again. We still want to give it, but that we're just going to do this instead. I'm pretty excited about the personhood conference because as we've been going through the content, I think this is a great time to contemplate personhood.
Yeah.
And we're seeing an interesting shift in society about the value of life throughout the world with this coronavirus. So it really is a good topic. Then the second thing is that we still have our domestic mission trips open for Pittsburgh in July because it's so far off. We actually had someone sign up yesterday, and so we're
Awesome.
we're still going forward with that. That's with Father Paul Abernathy and his leadership team at the Neighborhood Resilience Project in Pittsburgh. So I'm pretty excited about that. That's also available at missionsnevangelism.com if you want to go check that out. Reserve your spot. It's going to be really awesome. We have 2 weeks, first week of July, second week of July, so you can pick one that works for you. And the idea behind those mission trips, if you haven't heard about them before, is learning how to be a catalyst for change in your community. Father Paul, what they've been doing in the Hill District of Pittsburgh is incredible, and they are prepared to train others, no matter what your background is or the community that you're in, suburbia, downtown, whatever it is. They can help you start to reconnect with our history, which is Orthodox churches were always present in the community. And we've become a little secluded, a little bit too secluded. So if your church is a secret in your community, consider signing up for this mission trip. And then the last thing revolves, we've got a lot happening with the St. Athanasius Academy. Do you want to go first?
Yeah. I'll go first. So for the last 10 months, I've been the administrative coordinator for Project Mexico, doing lots of different projects for them. I really enjoyed my time working for them, but as of this week, I'm no longer employed by Project Mexico, and I got picked up by the St. Athanasius Academy of Orthodox Theology. So I now get to work for the St. Athanasius Academy, and I'm helping with curriculum development and content loading for the online classes. So I'm really enjoying that, and I'm excited about this this change of pace. The nice thing is I was already working from home, and I still get to keep working from home.
Is this our and then that you've come on, I forgot to mention, we opened registration on March 31st for the homeschooling studies.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And you've been helping us with the college courses.
Mm-hmm.
But you probably don't know that this past year, we opened the homeschool studies as our inaugural year with 5 classes.
Mm-hmm.
And we have for August scheduled 14 classes.
Nice.
Yes.
Yeah. I actually plan on enrolling my son in the English class.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That's great. So, yeah, we have lots of core subjects. We have English for middle school, 2 different English tiers for high school. We got pre-algebra coming on. We have some new Orthodox studies classes, which are going to be very interesting. Compelling conversations with Father David Rucker, where he's going to help high school students articulate their faith.
That'll be a good class.
Yeah, he's going to help them focus on what it is. And then, so there's a long list there. If you go to saaot.edu, I'll share that in the comment section.
Yeah. All right.
Do that right now. But there's a little too much to share. So we need to get going. Let's get going to our guest.
Let's bring our guest in today. Our guest today is one of the best historians and storytellers of our generation. We are so excited to have him here. He's got so many credentials and accomplishments. We can't even begin to list them, but I will give a plug. One of his amazing books from Ancient Faith Publishing is Everyday Wonders, Stories of God's Providence. I'd like to welcome Father Michael Oleksa, coming to us from Anchorage, Alaska.
Thank
Father
you.
Michael Oleksa from Alaska.
Yes. My last name often gets transformed into something like Alaska on a regular basis. I even get mail, Father Alaska.
Well, Father Michael, I want you to know that a couple years ago, I took a plane trip down to Tennessee, and I picked up this book in my church bookstore to have something to read on the trip. And I could not put it down. I read it before I landed in Tennessee, the whole thing. And before I read the book, I always believed in God's providence. I also believe that sometimes circumstances are circumstances. After reading your book, I no longer believe in circumstantial encounters. I only believe in God's providence. It's fantastic. It's light reading. It's fun reading. Off the air, I was saying my favorite story was reading about you getting pickpocketed in Bulgaria and then receiving a Christmas card from your pickpocket a year later asking for forgiveness. Those things don't happen by circumstance.
No, you mentioned earlier there's a story of my connecting with an altar boy in Kampala, Uganda, who had lived on the streets for years. He'd been abandoned by his parents when he was like in 5th grade, 11 years old. And then I asked him, well, if I could send you something, what would it be? What would you want from America? And he said, Air Jordans. The poor guy had only had flip-flops all his life, you see, so he a real pair of shoes. So I said, well, that'd be rather expensive. I would do that, but I wouldn't trust the customs agents or the post office to actually deliver them to you.
Right.
Third world country, they get stolen in America, let alone in Uganda. So I went to church with a friend of mine in Denver. We went to St. Luke's Church, in fact, just outside of Denver. And after liturgy in coffee hour, a woman walked up to me and said, I hear you're from Allentown, Pennsylvania. I said, well, not exactly. I'm from Emmaus. She said, you went to Emmaus High School? So did I. And so she moved to Colorado 20 years ago. I moved to Alaska 50 years ago. And so we're chatting. And she says, oh, excuse me, Father, but I have to leave now. I'm going home to pack for my trip to Uganda.
You can't make that up.
So, what are the chances of going to a parish in suburban Denver to find an Allentonian from Pennsylvania who then talks to you about hometown and then mentions their trip that week to Kampala? So they got the Air Jordans and she took them. And my altar boy got the shoes after all. But it's like, only God could have arranged that. No human being could have orchestrated that encounter. It had to be the hand of God.
You said that's actually chapter 12 of this book, and you said that you received a picture from her, right? With the altar boy.
The altar boy of the shoes. Yes, exactly. Yeah. I'm still in touch with him on a daily basis, actually.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. So
I have a question for you, Father Michael. It's interesting that I remember Father Matthew and I talked this while right after you got off the plane. We were talking about how it's harder and harder as you get older to believe in the idea of coincidence.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah.
It's very different. The more that we connect to God and to each other.
Absolutely. I read a quote years ago, actually, when I was in high school. It's in a book called A Diary of a Russian Priest. Mm-hmm. And the story of Father Alexander Elchaninov, who was a emigre in Paris, actually. And the diary was published in French originally. But I forget who published it in English. There was a quote in there, and I think it's misquoted. He says, "Nothing happens by accident. Anything that happens by accident does not really believe in God." Well, I think it's the original Russian word is coincidence. Accidents do happen. Planes crash, cars bump into each other. It's not the will of God. But coincidence, on the other hand, things do not happen by coincidence, especially human encounters. Human encounters are very much orchestrated by the hand of God. Fortunately, we don't know it at the time. Because if you realize that God was behind it right then and there, you might hesitate. For example, I didn't realize that when I volunteered to go to Alaska in the summer of 1970, it was a life-changing decision. For me, it was just a few months in Kodiak and the opportunity to attend the canonization of St. Herman. I didn't realize I'd be here the rest of my life, that I'd marry into this diocese, that I'd become involved with Alaskan Native history and culture, cross-cultural communications, build my whole life around that experience. If I'd known that going to Alaska that summer was going to be that kind of life-changing event, I might have hesitated. But you don't know at the time. You only see the hand of God when you look back. You can't see it when you look forward.
Wow. Yeah, that's true. That's absolutely true. I mean, yeah, if God had basically given you an advertisement, hey, come spend the next 50 years in Alaska, you likely won't have running water at your first parish assignment.
Well, yeah. You wouldn't know what you were in for. And then once you're there, you kind of make certain commitments and then you have to go with it. I think that's really a theme for the time we have left. Coming to Alaska in the 70s, most of our rural communities, as you mentioned, did not have running water. My first parish had a priest. He had 10 parishes on the Alaska Peninsula and around Lake Iliamna. I met people in my parish who say, yeah, Father Basil's predecessor, Father Sergei, I used to paddle him up the river and around the lake. It would take us a month. That's before there were planes, bush planes to fly or airfields to land on. The only way to get there was by boat, and the boats weren't motorized. You paddled.
And how big is the lake, Father?
It's the size of Connecticut. So, we have 5 parishes on the shores of that lake, and Father Basil was the priest for those parishes, and the only way to get there was in a kayak paddling up the Guijac River for 2 months. Well, that's what St. Innocent did on the Aleutian Islands. 10 years in the Aleutians. He was 6'3" or 6'4". He was huge. Aleuts are like 5'2", right? So they had to build him a special kayak. He paddled on the Pacific Ocean for 10 years from one village to the next. And the Aleutian Archipelago is 1,000 miles long. So imagine paddling, and that's the only way to do it. It's long before airplanes were invented. St. Yakov on the Yukon is the same story. So Alaska helps, I think, Orthodox Christians keep our current difficulties or circumstances in perspective. Yakov, for example, had only a tent church for the first dozen years on the Yukon River. The Yukon River is frozen 6 months of the year. It's ice, right? So his mail came to St. Michael's about 200 miles downstream from his headquarters. So in August, when the river was ice-free, they would paddle out the river a couple 100 miles down the river out into the ocean, pick up their supplies, the wine, the flour for church bread, the candles, the incense, the mail, send the outgoing mail out, bring the incoming mail in, and then paddle up the river. Some years, if the supply ship was delayed, the river froze before they got home. Then they had to unload the boats, send home for the dogs, and get the dog teams hooked up and come and pick up the supplies. That's what it took to get your mail delivered in 1855 on the Yukon River. And then you served in a tent where it was below zero for Holy Week and Pascha, let alone for Christmas.
Sure.
And we complain when the DHL package is a few hours late, or when there's a draft in the church. Right? So Alaska is one of those places that helps you keep things in perspective. You don't know how good you have it. People are home now because of the lockdowns and the coronavirus, but you've got streaming. You have recordings of church music and beautiful choirs. Our people went for months at a time without a service in the church. When I came to Alaska, I computed there were 15 priests and 85 parishes. So it was at his headquarters, his main parish where he resided, 8 to 10 months of the year. But the other months he was in a canoe or in a kayak paddling from parish to parish. And even me with an airplane, my first trip around Iliamna Lake and my 14 parishes that I was assigned to took a month. And that took a month without having to paddle. And my wife was alone, wondering if I'm still alive. I can imagine Matushka Veniaminov in the Aleutian Islands when Father John was paddling 1,000 miles out into the ocean.
In the ocean, yeah.
So
Father, can you tell us, so you mentioned the coronavirus. Can you tell us how people held on to their faith in those villages where they only saw a priest twice a year? What was that like for them? What can we learn from them?
Well, first of all, we have to consider that it was normal. But for them. Excuse me, it's sort of like when you read Civil War diaries, you wonder how the soldiers marched so far with so much equipment on their backs. It's the only way to get there. When it's normal, when it's what everybody has to do, when it's the way it's always been, you don't question it. It's only again when you look back, you see how difficult it was for them compared to how easy it is for us. But people were used to it. They knew the priest was coming. He'd come and stay several days, hear all the confessions, baptize all the babies, marry all the couples, if it weren't during a Lenten season, chrismate all those who had been baptized by the local reader or church officials, and then go on to the next village. And in the meantime, they had tipika service. They had a reader in the church who helped them sing the Psalms. And their job was to learn, in each village, was to learn as much as possible by heart, since very few of the people could read or write. So the reader is someone who actually could read, but that was 1 person out of 10, maybe 1 person out of 20. And they could read maybe in Slavonic or maybe in their native language, depending on what missionary had been there and what had been translated. Most of the translations, in fact, were not written down. So they had to be transmitted orally, and the only way to learn it was to memorize it. So I came to parishes where they actually knew the service in their own language by heart. Books were useless. The next generation, the 70s and 80s of the last century, that generation was learning to read in their own native language in school, and then it became necessary to write down what had never been written, because people in church to learn the liturgy by heart, which was the only way they could have learned it. And you have 100 people singing matins in Yupik Eskimo in 4-part harmony from memory. It's an impressive experience.
Yeah, I would imagine you wouldn't try to change the music. Like you wouldn't come in and try to change that after so long.
No.
It's
simply impossible. It's the way Grandma taught me. It's not going to change. It's good enough for me. Yeah.
So I have a question. You go next.
Go ahead. No, you go.
Well, I'm kind of curious about. We're hearing a lot about the history of this, but today, or let's say, up until recently, what does it look like? How do we have still some villages not getting a priest that often?
No, Well, it depends what you consider often. All the villages have priests much more often than they used to. When we had 15 priests in 85 parishes, it was under Bishop Gregory, which is the 1980s and early 1990s, the mandate was you have to visit each of your villages at least twice a year. That goes back to the time when you were still paddling from village to village, and when air travel existed, but it was very expensive, and the villages really couldn't afford to have the priest every month or every week. Now we have 50 clergy. I added them up in our website. We have 50 deacons and priests in the diocese and 93 parishes. But that's one parish for every two.
Or two parishes for every one clergy, yeah.
The priest can be at his headquarters most of the time, but at least visit his other parishes even monthly. So, and the satellite parish is often a mission. It's just being started. There might not even be a church building there. They're still meeting in someone's house or some public facility. So we have quite a few missions, in fact, in the Kuskokwim basin, the Kuskokwim Delta now. I think 5 or 6, in fact. So the church is still growing, but thanks to the seminary that was founded in 1973, we've trained and ordained a whole new generation of clergy. I'm the oldest priest left in the diocese now, when I started off as the youngest, of course, 50 years ago.
And is this diocese just Alaska?
Just Alaska. That's 4 time zones wide. So just Alaska is like saying just
just Alaska.
I didn't know if there was I actually said that wrong. What I meant was you have one diocese for the entire state.
Yes, the Diocese of Sitka and Alaska, founded in 1842. St. Innocent Veniaminov was the first bishop.
But with the size of that, and the numbers that you have, you might be moving towards maybe dividing at some point, right?
Well, because there are no roads, it would be impractical to divide.
Okay.
The headquarters has to be Anchorage. It's the hub. Almost everything comes through Anchorage, and then if we had roads and we had 100 parishes, it'd be time to have a vicar bishop for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, Father Matthew, you had a question?
I forgot what it
was. You forgot?
No, I forgot.
See, that's why I write things down. You need to have a notepad next to you.
Well, all right, I'll interrupt with a Bible question.
Oh, okay, good.
Okay.
Who's it
all
for?
Right.
Is it for Father Michael?
I think we'll give it to Father Michael.
Or anybody who can answer it.
All right. All right, Father Michael. This is from the Old Testament. What or who did Potiphar buy from Midianite traders? It's a hard one. Think back to Genesis.
I was going to say it goes back to Genesis and Joseph's brothers, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So the answer is Joseph.
Yeah,
Joseph. Yep. And since we're coming up on Holy Week next week, it's appropriate because we read about Joseph.
It's one of the most
the first 2 days of Holy Week.
Testament. There's a lot of violence in the Old Testament, but this is his brothers selling him because they're jealous. That's kind of one thing. And then when he meets them, he says it was all God's will. It wasn't a coincidence.
Yeah. Which Father
being sold into slavery, looking back, was not the tragedy that it was meant to be. It turns out to be the will of God. It's what saved the family.
Yeah. Father, can you talk about Saint Yaakov Netzvatov and the will? It was the will of God that you were talking to me about yesterday.
Oh yes, for Saint Yaakov, he was a contemporary of Saint Innocent. Saint Innocent was a few years ahead of him at the same seminary in Irkutsk. And he married a Russian woman and brought his matushka, his Korea, to Alaska, where he was born here, of course. He was Aleut, born on St. George Island, one of the most remote parishes in the world, a tiny island, a volcanic island in the Bering Sea. But he wasn't assigned to St. George, his hometown. He was assigned to Atka, about halfway out the Aleutian chain. He was there twice as long as St. Innocent, 20 years. His Russian wife got sick. The hospital was all the way in Sitka, more than 1,000 miles away. She was sent there, but died. That same year, his house burned down. And the nephew they were adopting as a son contracted pneumonia and also died. He was 20 years a priest by this time, still in his mid-40s. He wrote to the bishop and asked for a retirement. My house is burned down. My wife has died. I'm a widower. I have no family. Bless me to return to Russia and enter a monastery. St. Innocent wrote back, of course, Father Yakov, after 20 years in the Aleutian Islands, you deserve retirement. You can retire as soon as I find a replacement. 18 years later, he retired. And he spent those 18 years on the Yukon River among the Yupik Eskimo people, where he learned the language, devised an alphabet, opened the first schools, and eventually, after 12 years in a church, in a tent, built a church. So after all of this, he was slandered by a new priest who came in and said he was doing awful things, which wasn't true. He was summoned to Sitka to answer the accusations. The bishop exonerated him, and he was assigned to the Tlingit parish in Sitka, where he served the Tlingit Indian community until his death in 1864. And he's buried, therefore, in Sitka. He served his own people, the Aleuts, the Unangan. He served the Yupiks, and he served the Tlingit people. And when he was buried, they neglected to mark his grave. So sort of like other famous people, Mozart, for example, we don't know where he is, where his grave is. He's been canonized as a saint. He was forgotten, I would say, for most of after that. People just forgot who that guy was. He was an older man by the time he came to Sitka, so the Tlingit people didn't know what his career had been. And he marked his wife's grave. His wife's grave, he located and put over it a stone. Here lies Anna Semyonova Netsvetova, wife of Archpriest Yakov Netsvetov, who at this place awaits the resurrection on the last day. But his own gravesite, we're still looking for it. He's a saint. When we find it, we'll have holy relics. But for the time being, poor Father Yakov has been neglected and forgotten for most of the last century and a half. But we found his journals. Priests in those days were required to keep a daily log of their activities, pretty much routine. Had church school today for 12 kids, so many boys and so many girls. Had a funeral today for Mrs. So-and-so, that kind of stuff. But his journals also contain remarkable episodes in his life that, as we already cited, some of it's pretty routine for that time. But going out to the auction to get your mail, worshiping in a tent church at below zero temperatures for Holy Week and Pascha, etc. You say, if this guy's not a saint, there's no hope for the rest of us.
Yeah.
But it's amazing to think about what he did after he requested retirement during that period where he's waiting for retirement. And that's where you can see God's providence.
Yeah, exactly. His will would have been to go to Russia, retire quietly. And he wound up with a whole new career, founding the mission that is the mainstay of our diocese today. Most of our clergy are Yupik Eskimo. Most of our parishes are Yupik Eskimo. But the mission there was started by St. Yakov.
Wow.
He was even kidnapped by the Indians at one point. He wasn't assigned to the Athabascan Indians in the interior, but they came and fetched him. Get in the boat. You're coming with us. And they said, where are we going? Never mind. 4 days they paddled up the river, hundreds of miles. And then he said, they put me in this little hut. I waited till evening. And by sundown, they summoned me. I came out to the riverbank, and the river was covered with more than 100 vessels, kayaks, canoes, and one sailboat. Hundreds of Athabascan Indians converging on that site because they had shanghaied him. They kidnapped him deliberately and arranged at their own initiative to meet with him there and say, okay, now tell us your stories. And he started with Genesis and preached for 4 days. He told them the whole Bible pretty much orally for 4 days, after which these hundreds of people say, okay, we believe it, baptize us. And he had mass baptism in the river, first the men one day, the women the next, and then the teenagers and kids the third day. And he writes in his report to the bishop, from this activity, I became dreadfully tired. And then he says, but the sight of so many people, and here's the really critical point, so many people of different tribes, former enemies, now united and worshiping the true God together gives me such joy that all my physical aches and pains have left.
Mm-hmm.
They put him in a canoe, and he gets home in one day, going downriver with the flow of the river. But it's one of these. He didn't plan it.
Right.
he had no intention. He kept telling those Athabascans, those Indian people, "I'll come up someday," but he kept putting it off because that wasn't his assignment. He had enough to keep himself busy among the Yupik people. And then they came and got him. And then he baptized them. And those parishes are still Orthodox to this day.
Wow.
Wow.
Well, Father Matthew, I think we have time. I think we can squeeze in one more. What do you think? Or Father Michael, how do you want to close out today's?
I wanted to say something about Matushka Olga, because again, it's one of those looking back, you didn't know what it was happening. I was in Paramus, New Jersey at an adult class, and someone said, "What is Alaska like?" Now, that's too broad of a question. And I said, Alaska's like this. And I briefly told what I knew about Matushka Olga Michael, the Matushka in the village where my wife is from. And I just told about her life and her extraordinary, I would say, amazing death, and the signs that accompanied her burial. And I wrote it in Alaska, Orthodox Alaska, when I wrote the book. So a couple of pages in the back. 20 years later, someone else read that, who had had a vision of Matushka Olga, but without knowing who she was. And they were only able to identify her as Matushka Olga because they had read those few pages in the back of my book. And I only put them there because the elder in Paramus, New Jersey asked me about what Alaska is like. But all these coincidences tied together to make it possible for us to identify Matushka Olga as the woman who had been appearing to this other lady in upstate New York, who was not Orthodox and not even Christian at the time, but who was healed by her nevertheless. And it was the beginning, really, of the whole movement to canonize Matushka Olga. Looking back, it's the hand of God again. It's an everyday wonder. One more story in the book.
Oh, well, please, I think we have enough time. Tell a little bit more about Matushka Olga. Wasn't the counselor who helped this lady, wasn't she Orthodox?
Well, yes, it turns out the lady had this vision of being in a birch tree forest, and suddenly the Mother of God, she knew it was the Theotokos, walked out from the trees, but didn't say anything. She signaled, "Follow the woman behind me." She pointed to the woman behind. And a shorter woman came and signaled, "Follow me." So she followed. They came to a hill, sort of like a hobbit house. It's a traditional Yupik Eskimo house from hundreds of years ago. You go inside, it's like a tunnel entrance, like an igloo, but made of mud. The woman gestured for her to lie down. She treated her as if she was giving birth, except she wasn't pregnant. But the pain and the physical trauma that she had suffered from abuse as a child left her body. And then this woman helped her up, and they went outside, and the northern lights were dancing in the sky. She said, "I didn't know they moved until then." They do move, by the way. And there was a fire and a kettle, and they drank what's called tundra tea, Labrador tea. And then the woman finally spoke. She pointed to the aurora, the northern lights, and she said, "This is a sign from God of his ability to create great beauty where there had only been darkness and desolation." And then the lady started to walk away, and the woman having the vision called after her, "Who are you? What's your name?" And she answered, "Something indistinct, Olga." So she went to her therapist, who was an Orthodox Matushka, and asked if there was a Saint Olga. So of course there's a Saint Olga, Princess of Kiev. So they found her icon, and the woman said, "That's not the woman I met. Isn't there some other Saint Olga?" And it turns out that this therapist was also reading my book, Orthodox Alaska. And she said, "Well, maybe you meant Matushka Olga." So that's it. What's a Matushka? She had no idea. Well, that's the wife of a priest in the Russian tradition. Let's find her picture. And they wrote to me and they said, "Send us a picture of Matushka Olga." I have one. I have one here in my office. It's on my wall right behind me here.
There it is.
And I have another one. But she wrote to me the day before I was leaving for a year's sabbatical leave in Moscow. So I didn't have time to send her a picture. The woman didn't give up. She wrote to the village of Kwethluk, Alaska, and asked for a picture there. And they sent her a group shot, Matushka Olga with other women, sort of like a police lineup. so they could see if she could pick her out of a group.
Mm-hmm.
She identified her immediately. That's the woman I saw, except she was younger when I met her. And so, again, this is the beginning of the story of Matuszka Olga. But these are such amazing story. It's not coincidence. If this woman had done serious research on Labrador tea or auroras or traditional Yupik dwellings from 200 years ago, even then, I don't think she could have faked this. And she even knew how things smelled. She knew the fragrance of the tundra, and she described it with different spices. So this woman knew things that there was no way for someone in Ossining, New York to have researched, even if she wanted to. It was not a coincidence. It was not something fabricated. It was something really from God. I'm convinced of that for sure. And I'm happy to have played this minor role, which never would have happened except for the adult class in Paramus. That had the question in the first place.
All right. We can't let you go without you telling the story of Matuszka Olga's funeral.
Oh my. Well, I wasn't there, but my wife was. She fell asleep in the Lord after receiving the Holy Eucharist. The young priest came to the house and gave her communion, and she lay down and fell asleep, and it was her peaceful end, Christian ending to her life, painless, blameless, and peaceful. Her funeral, that night, the wind blew and all the ice melted. It's November in Alaska. The birds have migrated south in August, and the river has frozen for weeks already. But that night, it thawed. People came to her funeral by boat. After the funeral services, as they exited the church, birds flew over the procession, accompanied the procession around the church and to the gravesite. In the Yupik tradition, the funeral ends with Paschal songs, having beheld the resurrection of Christ, from matins and other Paschal songs. And the people fill in the grave as they're singing, and the church bell rings like at Holy Week, like at Bright Week, rather. And then the wind began to blow, and the ground itself froze again that night. It was as if the earth itself had opened to receive her and then closed again to cover her. In November of 1979, I think it was, 1979.
Wow.
Not a coincidence.
Not a coincidence.
Not at all.
I agree with you. We have someone saying hello, Father Michael. It's Father John Finley.
Oh, my greetings. Thanks.
Yeah. And several thank yous from the audience about the stories that you're sharing.
You know, Everyday Wonders are the stories that I've used in sermons over the years. And my parishioners, as I was subbing in Portland, Oregon several years ago, they said, "Father, have you written these down?" And I said, "No, I'll get around to it when I'm retired." And they said, "We'd like to point out you are retired. Get to work." So I began writing that summer, and I think I had about 30 stories, and then I didn't know what to do with them. And someone suggested, "Well, send them to Ancient Faith and see if they'd be interested in publishing those stories, true stories from my own pastoral life." And that's what became the book. And it's become, I must say, my bestseller now.
Well, your book, Orthodox Alaska, is absolutely wonderful too. But Father, can you tell me where's the church on this cover?
It's the cemetery church in the town of Kenai on the Kenai Peninsula south of Anchorage.
Okay.
Yeah.
We have a question. What is the status of Matuszka Olga being canonized?
Well, the Canonization Commission of the Holy Synod of the Orthodox Church in America is responsible, and Archbishop Melchizedek of Pittsburgh, I believe, is the chairperson of that commission. You'll have to ask him. Actually, I had some women in the DC area who said, if they don't act on this soon, we're going to go picket Archbishop Melchizedek. So, Archbishop Melchizedek, if you listen to this broadcast, watch out, the ladies are coming to picket until Matuszka Olga gets notified.
They're going to cut off your supply of pierogies.
Right.
Yeah. Well,
I'm sure that in God's time she'll be canonized. when the time is right.
I did hear that there was some hesitancy just because she has living relatives. I think her oldest son recently passed away, Ivan, but the others are. But you see, I don't think that that's a valid objection. Martyrs are saints on the day of their martyrdom, whether they have family members, surviving members of their family still alive or not, is sort of, irrelevant. I think the women of the church will certainly appreciate the glorification of a woman who was a matushka, a midwife, and mostly famous for her generosity, knitting and sewing, and simply like Tabitha in the Book of Acts, doing all that just to give it away, to provide for others.
Yeah.
So, the patron saint of all those who knit and sew, as well as those who bake prospera, or sing in the choir, or are matushki, priest wives.
That's good. Yeah. Father Matthew?
Yeah, I could listen to stories all day long. We're gonna have you back to tell more stories, Father Michael.
I'd be glad to. Anytime. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. So let's call it a wrap for today. And I've shared a link to the Ancient Faith store in the comment section so that you can go get this book where all these stories are coming from. So, go check that out. Who knows how many more weeks we're going to be at home. So go order a book, get some reading done.
Yeah. Start knitting and sewing
and baking.
Right.
We have a number of households that are baking, bread at home and sharing it on Sunday afternoon because they're not able to have the actual blessed bread. So there's so many great stories here and inspirations.
Yeah.
And
Thank
again,
you so much.
A reminder: there are no coincidences.
It's only providence.
That's right. Thank you so much, Father Michael.
My pleasure.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
And Father Matthew, thank you for arranging this.
You're welcome. The last story of Providential Encounters. The last Sunday that we were able to get together as clergy in this area was the Sunday of Orthodoxy, and Father Michael happened to sit down next to me at the Lenten meal afterward, and I said, "Hey, would you be interested?" And we got it scheduled. And 1 week, if that gathering had been 1 week later, we wouldn't have made it because things were starting to shut down at that point in March.
Wow. Yeah.
Did I know who he was or that this program existed? No, not at the time. So here we are. Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Here we are.
I said Deacon Adam Roberts, and he said, "No way. I don't want to go near that." No, he said, who's it? What is this? But thank you for sharing, Father Michael. We're getting lots and lots of comments from people, more than normal, saying that this is joyful and uplifting and edifying, and they love to listen to you all day long. So we'll schedule a time for you to come back and share some more stories after Pascha.
It'll be a joy. Thank you so much.
Okay. Have a blessed Holy Week and a joyful Pascha.
All of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Until next time.